The morning Winifred Boone drove her cattle into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, every man at the stockyard turned to stare, not because she had the finest herd they had ever seen, but because they could not believe a woman had driven one at all. The sun had barely cleared the flat horizon when she brought her 32 head down the main road into town, her boots worn through at the left heel, her father's old hat pulled low against the dust that rose in brown curtains from the dry earth. She sat straight in the saddle, her dark chestnut mare, Belle, moving with the practiced patience of a horse that had made this journey before. Winifred had not. This was her first sale, and she knew it, and she told herself that knowing it did not have to show on her face. Her father, Clement Boone, had died in February, 2 weeks after the first hard frost broke the water pipes in the barn, and 1 week before the bank note came due on the property. He had been 53 years old and had never once been sick a day in his life, and then his heart simply stopped while he was mending a stretch of fence on the eastern pasture. Winifred had found him at dusk, lying in the yellow grass with one gloved hand still wrapped around a strand of wire. She was 26 years old and she had 2 choices. She could sell the land, take whatever the bank agreed to give her after the debt was cleared, and move somewhere that had no memory of her name. Or she could sell the cattle, pay the note, and keep the land that her father had broken his back on for 30 years. She chose the cattle. The Caldwell stockyard was one of the busiest in southern Kansas in those years, sitting at the end of the Kishom Trail where it turned north from the Indian Territory. Drovers brought longhorns up from Texas. Ranchers from the surrounding counties brought their seasonal stock, and buyers came from as far as Kansas City and Chicago looking for beef they could put on a train heading east. It was a loud, dusty, masculine world of shouted bids and handshake deals, and the constant low thunder of hooves on packed earth. Winifred registered her lot with the yard clerk, a thin man named Grady who looked up from his ledger, looked at her, looked at the cattle milling in the pen behind her, and then looked back at his ledger with the expression of a man performing a remarkable act of restraint. "Lot 44, he said, writing it down. "You understand the bidding starts at 9 and moves fast." "I understand," she said. "Sellers stand at the rail and call out if they want to reject a bid. I know how a cattle sale works, Mr. Grady." He looked up again. Something shifted in his face that was not quite respect, but was at least the acknowledgement that she was not going to be managed. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and handed her the lot ticket. She found her place at the rail near the main ring and waited. The yard filled steadily as the morning grew warmer, men in dusty coats and wide-brimmed hats gathering in clusters, talking about prices and weather and the railroad's latest decisions regarding freight rates. A few of them noticed her. A few of them spoke about her in voices low enough that she could not hear the exact words, but loud enough that she understood the tone perfectly. She had grown up with that tone. It was the tone of men who had decided before looking at anything that there was nothing worth looking at. One man, a heavy-set buyer named Dexter Prout who had a gold watch chain stretched across his vest and a voice built for carrying across open spaces, stopped near her at the rail and looked at her lot number. "Lot 44, he said, more to the man beside him than to her. "What in the world?" "My cattle are in good condition," Winifred said, keeping her voice even. "Good weight, healthy. You're welcome to look before the bidding starts." Prout smiled the way men smile when they are about to say something they find very clever. "I'm sure they are, sweetheart, I'm sure they are." He moved along the rail, still talking to his companion, and she heard the word novelty, and then the word amusement, and then they were too far away. She kept her hands flat on the rail and breathed. The sale opened with the large lots from the Texas drovers, hundreds of longhorns that moved through the ring in waves while the auctioneer, a man named Pete Hollies who could speak faster than most people could think, called numbers in a rising torrent of sound. Buyers raised fingers or nodded or said nothing, and deals were struck in seconds, and the animals moved on, and the next group came through. When Lot 44 was called, Winifred walked to the gate and her cattle entered the ring. They were not longhorns. They were a crossbred stock, carefully managed over several years by her father, stockier and better suited to the local climate than the trail cattle. They were also, she knew with certainty, in better individual condition than most of what had passed through the ring that morning. The auctioneer called the opening bid. Silence. He called it again, lower, with a slight adjustment in his tone that she recognized as accommodation, the way you lower your voice when explaining something to someone who might not fully understand. Fine lot here, ladies and gentlemen, 32 head, good weight, locally raised. Who wants to start us off? A man near the back offered a figure that was insultingly low, the kind of figure you offer when you want to establish a floor with no intention of going higher. Someone laughed. Not cruelly, just the casual laughter of men who found the situation mildly entertaining. A woman at a cattle sale, her herd ringed by professional buyers who had already made up their minds that this was a curiosity, something to observe between the real transactions of the day. Winifred felt the heat rise in her face and held herself still. She looked at her cattle standing in the ring. She had fed them through a hard winter. She had broken ice off the water troughs every morning for 3 months. She had done it alone after her father died with her hired hand, an old man named Ezra who had a bad hip and did his best. She had done it because it needed doing and because those animals were worth something real, not the figure being murmured at the back of the crowd. She was about to call out, to reject the bid and demand better, when a voice spoke from the far side of the ring. $42 a head. The crowd went quiet in a different way. The laughter stopped. The auctioneer paused mid-breath. $42 a head for a locally raised mixed-breed lot was not just a serious bid. It was a statement. It was what those cattle were actually worth, what any honest buyer looking at their condition would have recognized immediately. It was the full price. Winifred turned toward the voice. The man standing at the far rail was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent years doing actual physical work rather than managing other people who did it. He wore a plain canvas coat over a dark shirt, and his hat was a working hat, not decorative, the brim shaped by weather and use. He was perhaps 30 or 31, she guessed, with a strong jaw and dark eyes that were currently moving over her cattle with the careful, professional attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. Marshall Malone, someone near her murmured, in the way people say a name that comes with its own context, and she filed it away. No other bid came. The auctioneer, after a beat of silence that was itself a kind of commentary on what had just happened, confirmed the sale at $42 a head, and the gavel came down, and it was done. Winifred walked around the ring to where the man was standing. Up close he was slightly more weathered than she had judged, lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into sun and wind, but there was nothing hard or closed in his face. He was watching her approach with an expression she could not immediately categorize, attentive and direct without being forward. "Mr. Malone," she said. "Miss," he touched the brim of his hat. "I want to thank you for a fair bid." He looked at her with a slight furrowing of his brow, as if the thanks puzzled him. "It was a fair price for fair cattle," he said. "That's not charity if that's what you're about to say." She almost smiled. "It's not what I was going to say." "Good." He turned back to the ring where his newly purchased animals were being moved toward the holding pens. Because they're genuinely well-conditioned stock, better than most of what came through this morning, whoever managed them knew what they were doing. "My father," she said, "and then me after he passed in February." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that the silence was genuine rather than performative. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and it sounded like something he actually meant. "He loved those cattle," she said, and then stopped, because that was more than she had intended to say to a stranger. Marshall Malone looked at her steadily. "Then they went to a good home," he said. "I'll see they're well kept." Winifred nodded once sharply, the way you nod when you are trusting something valuable to someone and need to believe they will honor it. Then she went to find the yard clerk to collect her payment. She had the banknote money by noon. She stood outside the bank for a moment in the white spring sun. holding the receipt in both hands and feeling something she had not felt since February. Something like a door that had been pressed shut against its frame with tremendous force suddenly allowed to ease open. Just slightly, just enough to let in a thread of air. She ate lunch at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the main street, a clean, quiet place run by a woman named Mrs. Farwell who brought coffee without being asked and did not make conversation unless invited. Winifred sat at the table by the window and ate slowly and tried to decide how she felt about what had happened at the yard that morning. The dismissal she had expected. She had prepared herself for it in the same way she had prepared herself for every version of being told, in various tones and from various angles, that she did not belong in the place she had chosen to occupy. She had been preparing herself for that kind of thing for most of her adult life. What she had not prepared for was Marshall Malone. Not specifically him, she told herself. What she had not prepared for was someone simply looking at her cattle and seeing what they were. That was all. The surprise was in the fairness of it, not in the man himself. She did not know the man himself. She told herself this firmly and drank her coffee and decided to be on her way home before the afternoon heat peaked. She was untying Belle from the hitching post outside the restaurant when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. "Miss Boone," she turned. Marshall Malone was standing on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a way that suggested he was not entirely certain what he was doing there. "Mr. Malone," she said, "I hope I'm not intruding." He stopped a respectful distance away. "I wanted to say, and I know this is forward, that I think what you did this morning took considerable nerve. Bringing a herd in alone, managing that sale without any help and standing there while they made a joke of it." He paused. "I've been buying cattle in this yard for 4 years, and I have never once seen anyone handle it with more composure than you did." Winifred looked at him for a moment, measuring. He was not flattering her. He was not being kind in the way that is really another form of condescension. He was saying what he thought directly, the way you say it when you want to be understood. "I was very close to losing my composure," she said honestly. Something in his face shifted, a very slight warming that was not quite a smile but was close. "That's what made it impressive," he said. She finished tying Belle and turned to face him fully. "You said someone told you my name." "You knew it before I introduced myself." He nodded. "Grady the clerk," I asked. "I wanted to know who owned that lot before I bid on it." "Why?" "Because I like to know who I'm doing business with." He paused. "And because I was curious about you." There was no pretense in how he said it. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered the way you state facts that seem obvious to you even if they might not be to someone else. "I live about 8 miles east of here," she said. "The Boone Ranch." "I know the land," he said. "Good land. Your father ran it well. I intend to run it better." He looked at her with those direct dark eyes and something changed in his expression again. Something that settled rather than shifted. The way a thing settles when it finds the place it belongs. "I believe you will," he said. She rode home in the late afternoon with the bank receipt tucked against her chest, and the sound of a gavel coming down at $42 ahead still living somewhere in her memory like a clean note struck on a well-tuned bell. She thought about him on the road home. She could not entirely stop herself from doing so. She thought about the way he had spoken, without decoration, without the managing quality that most men applied when they spoke to women about serious things. She thought about the way he had looked at her cattle, with recognition. She thought about the faint turning of his hat brim in his hands and decided it meant he was honest, because men who were performing honesty didn't fidget. Then she told herself to stop thinking about him because she had 32 fewer cattle than she'd had that morning, a banknote cleared, and a ranch to rebuild, and those were the things that required her attention. The ranch looked different when she rode in at dusk than it had looked when she had left that morning. Or perhaps she was the one who was different. The house was a solid structure, 2 stories, white paint going gray at the edges, a wide porch where her father had spent his evenings. The barn was large and well built, better than the house in some ways because that was the way her father had prioritized things. The fields beyond were coming into spring green, and the fences were mostly sound. Ezra was sitting on the porch step when she rode in. He was 60 years old and had worked for her father for 17 years and had stayed on after Clement's death without being asked or offered more than the same wages he'd always received. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Banknotes clear," she said. He nodded slowly. "Your father would be pleased. I got 42 ahead." He looked up sharply. "That's full price." "Yes," she said, "it is." She told him about the sale and about Marshall Malone, keeping her account factual and brief, and Ezra listened and then said, "Malone, I know that name. He runs the Double M spread north of Sumner County. Good outfit. Honest man, people say." "People say correctly," Winifred said, and then went inside before Ezra could see whatever was on her face. She lay awake for a while that night, listening to the spring wind move through the eaves, and made herself a practical accounting of her situation. The land was hers now, free and clear. She had enough stock remaining to build from, a small breeding pair and several younger animals she had not brought to market. She had Ezra, and she had her own 2 hands, and she had her father's knowledge of the land and its rhythm stored in her memory like a library she had been reading since childhood. She did not need Marshall Malone for any practical purpose. This was a true thing, and she acknowledged it, and then she went asleep. The following week brought rain, a good soaking rain that filled the stock tank and laid the spring dust and turned the hills east of the ranch a vivid, improbable green. Winifred spent the wet days inside doing the accounting she had been putting off, going through her father's ledgers and understanding, for the first time, the full picture of the ranch's financial history. It was a complicated picture. There had been good years and lean years, and the lean years had required creativity, and she could see the evidence of that creativity in the careful adjustments of her father's handwriting over the decades. She was at the desk on the 3rd day of rain when Ezra came to the door and said, "Rider coming." She went to the window. Through the gray curtain of rain, a horse was approaching up the main track, a big gray animal moving steadily, carrying a man in a dark oilskin coat. She knew the horse before she recognized the rider. She had noticed the horse at the stockyard, a well-built gray with strong hindquarters and a calm manner. She had thought it was a fine horse and had noted, because she noticed these things, that the man riding it sat balanced and easy in the way of someone who had been on horseback since before he could walk. She went to the door and opened it before he could knock. Marshall Malone stood on her porch with rain dripping from his hat brim, holding his hat in one hand and a paper-wrapped bundle in the other. He looked slightly startled by the promptness of her appearance at the door. "Mr. Malone," she said. "Miss Boone." He held up the bundle. "I brought the registration papers for your cattle. I wanted you to have them. The original pedigree records your father filed. The yard clerk gave them to me with the sale, but they belong to you for your own records." She looked at the bundle for a moment and then at him. "You rode 8 miles in the rain to bring me paperwork." He held her gaze. "I also wanted to see how the ranch was doing," he said, "and to ask if there was anything you needed." She held the door open wider. "Come in out of the rain, Mr. Malone." He came in. She took his coat and hung it by the door. He stood in her front room looking at it with the same careful attention he had given her cattle, the stone fireplace, the bookshelves that ran along the east wall, the framed map of the county that her father had hung decades ago and never taken down. "You have a good library," he said. She glanced at the shelves. "My father read everything he could find. He believed a man who didn't read wasn't properly using his mind. And women. He believed the same of them. He educated me the same way he would have educated a son." She paused. "He didn't have a son." "He had you," Marshall said simply. She looked at him. He was looking at the bookshelf and not at her when he said it, which somehow made it easier to hear. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table while the rain continued against the windows, and she put the registration papers to one side and they talked. Not about cattle specifically, though that came up. They talked about the land, about how her father had managed the eastern pasture differently from the western one due to the difference in grass types. They talked about the Indian Territory to the south, and the changes along the trail since the railroads had come, and what that meant for ranchers who had previously depended on the drive north to market. They talked about books, and she discovered that he had read considerably, more than she would have guessed, not formally educated but genuinely curious, which she recognized as the better kind of education anyway. He stayed for 2 hours. When he stood to go, he did so with the slightly reluctant manner of someone who would have stayed longer if he thought it was welcome, and she found that she wanted to tell him it was welcome but did not, because it was only his second visit and she did not know what she was doing yet. "I'll be back in Caldwell at the end of the month," he said, putting on his coat. "For the spring sale. If you're bringing more stock, I'd be glad to see you." "I may be," she said. "I have a pair of breeding animals I'm undecided about." "What makes you undecided?" She thought about it. "Sentiment," she said. "My father was fond of them." "Sentiment's not nothing," he said. "Keep them if you want to keep them." She watched him ride away into the rain on his big gray horse and stood on the porch for a longer moment than was strictly necessary. Ezra appeared from the barn, pulling his coat around him against the wet. He looked at the retreating rider and then at Winifred standing on the porch. "That was Marshall Malone," he said. "Yes." Ezra nodded slowly. He had the weathered discretion of a man who had learned long ago which observations to make out loud and which to keep to himself. He made his observation to himself and went back to the barn. The next several weeks moved with the particular rhythm of spring ranch work, which was relentless. There was fencing to repair after the winter. There was the breeding pair to manage. There were decisions about which young stock to keep and which to sell. There was the kitchen garden to put in. And there was the house itself, which needed attention in the way houses do when they have had a single older man living alone in them for 2 years. Winifred worked from before sunrise to after dark most days, and she fell asleep each night with the specific satisfied exhaustion of someone who has spent their day doing exactly what they are built for. Marshall Malone came again 3 weeks after the rain visit. This time the weather was clear and warm, and he arrived in the late morning with a legitimate reason. He wanted to ask about the grazing land to the southeast of her property, which bordered his own holdings in a complex arrangement that had always involved a shared water source. He needed to understand whether she intended to keep the same grazing rotation her father had maintained, because it affected his own planning. It was a practical conversation. It was also 3 hours long and covered, by the end, topics considerably further afield than grazing rotations. He met Ezra properly this time, and the two men took to each other immediately, the way old practical men and younger practical men sometimes do when they recognize in each other the same commitment to doing things correctly rather than quickly. Ezra showed him the barn repairs Winifred had been overseeing, and she watched Marshall look at them with attention, asking questions that showed he understood what he was looking at. "Good joint work," he said about one of the repaired beams. "Miss Boone did that one herself," Ezra said, without particular emphasis, "the way you state something that is simply true." Marshall looked at her. She looked back at him. He said nothing, but something in his expression said it clearly enough. When he left that afternoon, he lingered at the gate for a moment, turning his hat in his hands in the way she had come to recognize. "There's a dance at the Grange Hall in Sumner next Saturday," he said, not looking directly at her but rather at a point somewhere between her and the middle distance. "I don't know if you're the sort who goes to dances." "I haven't been to one in a while," she said honestly. He looked at her then. "Would you come?" "With me?" She considered him. She considered the question. She considered the fact that she had been thinking about him with increasing frequency for 3 weeks, and that this was information about herself she ought to act on rather than suppress. "I would," she said. The dance at Sumner's Grange Hall was a plain, happy affair, the kind of social event that small communities in southern Kansas organized in the spring, when the worst of the winter isolation was over, and people needed to remember that they liked each other. The hall was lit with oil lamps, and a fiddle player named Caleb Marsh played with a drummer and a man with a harmonica, and the music was good enough to make even reluctant dancers move. Winifred wore her best dress, a dark green wool that her mother had made years ago and that she had maintained carefully since, and she put her hair up properly for the first time in weeks, and she felt, when she looked in the mirror, more like herself than she had in a long time. Marshall collected her at 7 o'clock in a wagon that he had clearly cleaned and prepared. He wore a dark jacket over a white shirt and had his hat brushed. He helped her up into the wagon and then settled beside her, and for the first mile or so neither of them spoke, but it was a comfortable silence rather than an awkward one, the silence of two people who have already established that they can talk to each other and don't need to prove it immediately. "You look very well," he said eventually. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." "I feel slightly out of my element in a jacket," he said. She laughed genuinely, and he glanced at her sideways with an expression that she thought might be the most unguarded she had seen from him, something that was simply pleased, without any management or restraint. The hall was full when they arrived. She knew several people there, neighbors and acquaintances from years of living in the area, and she saw immediately that their arrival together registered with people, the way arrivals together always register in small communities. She did not mind. She had never been someone who was bothered by being noticed. Dexter Prout was there, the heavy-set buyer from the stockyard, and he saw her across the room and said something to the man beside him that caused them both to look. She met his gaze with a pleasant expression and looked away, because he was not worth more than that. She danced with Marshall. He was a better dancer than she would have expected from a man who claimed to feel out of his element in a jacket, competent and well-timed, with a natural sense of rhythm that probably came from the same physical attentiveness that made him a good horseman. She matched him easily, because she had been dancing since she was a child, her father having been of the opinion that dancing was a civilized pleasure that everyone should know. They danced 3 dances together, and then stood against the wall with cups of cold water and talked to the people who came to speak with them, and then danced 2 more. And by the end of the evening she was aware of a particular quality of happiness that she had not felt in a very long time. Not the desperate relief of the bank note cleared, and not the deep satisfaction of ranch work done well, but something lighter than either of those, something that lived in the chest rather than the shoulders. On the drive home, the stars were extraordinary, the way they are in Kansas on clear spring nights, dense and brilliant across the whole sky. "I want to ask you something," she said about halfway back. "Ask it," he said. "Why did you really come back to the ranch with the papers in the rain? Because you could have sent them with Grady." He was quiet for a moment, the horse's hooves steady on the road. "Because I wanted to see you," he said, "and the papers gave me a reason that wasn't presumptuous." She thought about that. "I appreciated the reason," she said, "but you didn't need it." He looked at her in the darkness of the wagon. "I know that now," he said. She let him walk her to the porch. They stood in the lamp light that came through the front window, and he held his hat in his hands, and she was very aware of the short distance between them. "Winifred," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice than it did in anyone else's, fuller somehow, more considered. He had not used her given name before. "Marshall," she said, giving it back to him in the same way. He smiled, a real smile, not managed or restrained, just the real thing, and it changed his whole face in a way that did something significant to her composure. "Good night," he said, and touched the brim of his hat and walked back to the wagon, and she stood on the porch until the sound of the hooves was gone, and then went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while before going up to bed. Summer came in hard and hot, the way it does in Kansas, settling over the land like a hand pressed flat. The grass bleached to gold, and the creek dropped, and Winifred spent the early mornings checking the stock tank levels, and the afternoons in the shade of the barn doing the work that could be done sitting down. She corresponded with a buyer in Kansas City about her fall stock, and she reviewed her father's records and made her own projections, and she planted more of the kitchen garden than she had originally planned. Marshall came often now. Not every week, but regularly enough that the sound of the gray horse on the track became familiar, became something she oriented her day toward without particularly intending to. He came to help with the more physical work sometimes, a fence section that was too much for Winifred and Ezra alone, the repositioning of a heavy post in the barn. He never offered help in the way that suggested she needed it because she was incapable. He offered it the way you offer it to a neighbor you want to be useful to. One afternoon in July he arrived to find her on the roof of the barn. She heard the horse below and looked down over the edge. He stood in the yard looking up at her with an expression that combined surprise and something that might have been alarm. "There's a section of roofing that's been leaking," she called down. "I can see that," he said. "I can also see you're up there with no one on the ground. Ezra's in town." He tied his horse and climbed up after her. She heard him come up the ladder and then the careful footsteps across the sloped surface, and then he was beside her, looking at the damaged section she was patching. "You know how to do this?" he asked. "My father showed me," she said. "Hand me that piece." He handed her the roofing piece. She set it in place and drove the nails, and he held it steady without being asked, because he could see that holding it steady was useful. They worked side by side on the roof for an hour, the summer heat pressing down and the flat prairie visible in every direction for miles, an enormous landscape that in the right light and at the right time of year could look like everything or like nothing, depending on how you were feeling about the world. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment, fitting another piece of roofing. "My spread is 40 miles north. I built the house myself mostly. It's not elaborate, but it's solid." He paused. "The land joins the north end of your eastern pasture if you follow the county line." "I know the geography," she said. "I know you do." He looked at her sideways. "I'm working up to something. I'm not doing it very smoothly." She stopped hammering. She sat back on the roof with the hammer in her hand and looked at him. He looked back at her with those direct, dark eyes, and she could see that whatever he was working up to was costing him something, not because it was difficult to feel, but because it was difficult to say, because he was a man who believed that saying things had consequences and should be taken seriously. "I think you know what I'm going to say," he said. "I have a reasonable idea," she said. "I don't want to presume." "You're not presuming," he breathed out slowly. "I've been coming here as often as I could think of reasons to," he said. "And the last several weeks I've been running out of reasons and coming anyway, and I think you've known that." "I have," she said. "I'm in love with you," he said plainly, without decoration, the same way he stated everything he meant. "I've been trying to say it for about a month and I keep finding reasons not to, and I'm tired of not saying it." The heat pressed down around them, and the prairie stretched out in all directions, and somewhere below a horse snorted softly in the yard. "Marshall," she said, and her own voice surprised her a little with how certain it sounded. "I've been in love with you since approximately the third time you came to my kitchen and stayed 2 hours longer than you needed to." The smile broke across his face again, that real unmanaged smile, and she felt the same thing she had felt on the porch after the dance, that lightness in the chest, except it was considerably stronger now. He leaned across the short distance of the rooftop and kissed her, briefly and carefully, on the corner of her mouth, the kind of kiss that is a question rather than a declaration, that leaves the answer entirely to the other person. Her answer was to turn toward him and kiss him properly, and the hammer fell off the edge of the roof with a distant clank, and neither of them noticed for a while. They sat on the roof of the barn for another hour after that, talking in the way people talk when they have finally said the true thing, and the world has reorganized itself around the truth. They talked about the future with the particular seriousness and lightness mixed together that belong to conversations about futures that are being genuinely planned rather than vaguely imagined. He told her about the double M spread, about the house he had built, about his plans for expanding the herd in the next 2 years. She told him about her projections for the Boone land, about the breeding pair she had kept for sentiment and was now glad she had kept. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "but I want to do it properly, not on a roof." She looked at him. "Why not on a roof?" she said. "It seems as good a place as any." He laughed, and she loved the sound of it and thought that she wanted to spend a very long time hearing that sound. "Because your father's land deserves to be part of the asking," he said more quietly. "And I want you to know that I understand what this place means to you before I ask you to consider what combining it with mine might mean." She was quiet for a moment. The western sky was moving toward a late afternoon gold, the light that makes Kansas look like a painting of itself. "It means everything," she said. "This land, I want you to know that before you ask." "I know it," he said, "and I would never ask you to choose between it and anything else. That's not the question." "What is the question?" "Whether you want to build something together," he said, "here and there and wherever makes sense. Whether you want a partner who sees you clearly and thinks that what he sees is extraordinary." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You can ask me properly whenever you like, but I want you to know that the answer is yes." He nodded once, and she saw something in his face that she could only describe as relief and gratitude, and a deep quiet happiness all arriving at the same moment. He took her hand, and they sat together on the ridge of the barn roof, while the light went gold and then amber, and then the first pale stars began to appear. The proper asking happened 2 days later, on a Sunday evening. He came to the ranch in the late afternoon, and they walked the eastern pasture together, the long golden grass brushing against their hands, the breeding pair watching them with their large, incurious eyes from across the field. He stopped at the fence corner where her father had died, a place she had told him about during one of their long kitchen table evenings, and he turned to her with the hat in his hands and asked her, in simple and direct language, to be his wife. She said yes with the same simplicity and directness, and he put the hat on the fence post and took her face in his hands and kissed her in the warm evening air of her father's pasture. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she told her father about it, because it seemed like the kind of thing he would have wanted to know. They told Ezra that evening. He received the news with his characteristic weathered dignity, and then his composure slipped just slightly in a way that involved his jaw working and his eyes becoming more interested in the middle distance than was strictly necessary. And then he shook Marshall's hand with both of his and said, "Clement would have liked you." And that was that. The practical considerations of combining 2 ranches occupied the next 2 months in a deeply satisfying way. Winifred had strong opinions about most things, and so did Marshall, but they had, in the months of getting to know each other, identified the areas in which their opinions naturally aligned, and the areas in which they did not, and they had established the habit of discussing differences directly rather than managing around them, which meant that disagreements were generally resolved efficiently and without damage. The Boone land would remain the Boone land. That was the first and most important thing they agreed on. Her father's name on the deed would stay, the breeding pair would stay, the kitchen garden would stay. Winifred would continue to manage the South operation and Marshall the North, and they would coordinate on everything that touched both. The second thing they agreed on was that the house at the Double M needed a better kitchen. "The current one is a disaster," Marshall said, with the honest self-assessment she had come to appreciate in him. "I'll design it," she said. "I expected nothing less," he said. They were married in September of 1882 in the small church in Caldwell, on a bright, cool day that smelled of autumn and turned grass. The ceremony was small, because neither of them had extensive family nearby. Marshall's brother Thomas came from Missouri, a quieter version of Marshall with the same jaw and a pleasant wife named Clara. Several neighbors attended, and Ezra sat in the front row in a coat that he had clearly kept for important occasions and pressed specifically for this one. Winifred wore her mother's dress, white cotton with small blue flowers, altered to fit her properly, and she carried late summer wildflowers from the pasture behind the barn. She had made no attempt to be anything other than what she was, and what she was, she felt, was enough. When Marshall turned to look at her coming down the aisle, his expression was the same one she had been cataloging and returning to for months. That deep, steady attention that was not performance, that was simply the way he looked at things he valued. He looked at her that way in the stockyard ring, standing at his own porch, working beside her on the barn roof, and now here in the small church with autumn sun coming through the plain windows. And it was the same look every time, and she thought it might be the most reliable thing she had ever encountered. The minister, a young man named Reverend Cross, who was clearly moved by the occasion to a degree slightly beyond his professional composure, read the words, and they gave the words back, and then it was done, and Marshall's hand was warm around hers, and outside the church the day was brilliant. Thomas Malone shook his brother's hand and embraced Winifred with genuine warmth. Clara pronounced the Boone Ranch the finest piece of land she had seen in Kansas, and offered to share a recipe for apple preserves that she claimed was not to be found anywhere else, and Winifred accepted because she genuinely liked Clara within 10 minutes of meeting her. Ezra was the last to come through the line. He shook Marshall's hand again, and then looked at Winifred with an expression that would have been impossible to describe in simple terms. Everything that someone who has known you since you were young and watched you become yourself brings to their face at a moment like this. "Your father," he started, and then stopped. "I know," she said. He nodded. That was enough. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that tests things not catastrophically but thoroughly. The cold came early in November and settled in with determination, and the work of keeping 2 operations running through the hard months required every skill and hour they had between them. Winifred managed the southern stock, and Marshall rode the 40 miles back and forth more than was easy, and they began to seriously discuss whether to establish a winter base at the Boone Ranch since it was better situated relative to both operations. In December, they found that the Double M's northern fence line had been cut in 2 places, the work of cattle rustlers who had been moving through Sumner County, taking advantage of the winter isolation to pick off animals from remote parts of ranches. Marshall discovered the cuts on a morning ride and came back to tell Winifred with a controlled anger that she recognized as the way he handled things that enraged him without expressing the rage in ways that weren't useful. "How many head?" she asked. 12, as best I can count." He poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking north. "I found the track going toward the territory line. Have you spoken to the sheriff? Sheriff Dolan is in Caldwell. By the time he rides up, the track will be cold." She thought for a moment. "What about your neighbor to the east, Webb?" "Clem Webb has seen the same cuts on his southern fence. He thinks it's the same outfit." "Then you go to Dolan together," she said. "And you take the track information and Webb's confirmation and you make it a pattern rather than a single incident. Dolan will act on a pattern." He looked at her. "That's exactly right," he said. "Also," she said, "you increase the morning ride perimeter for the next 3 weeks and you hire 1 more hand for the northern section because you cannot physically cover that much ground alone." He nodded slowly. "I was thinking the same thing about the hand." "I know you were," she said. "Do it." They went to Sheriff Dolan together, Winifred and Marshall and Clem Webb, a taciturn older rancher who had lived in Sumner County for 20 years and had the demeanor of someone who had seen everything at least twice. Dolan was a competent lawman, practical and unflappable, and he took the information seriously and organized a response, a combination of rancher patrols and his own deputies covering the territory border over a 2-week period. The rustlers were caught in January, 3 men trying to move a combined herd of stolen animals south through the territory, and the recovered stock was returned to Webb and Malone, minus 2 animals that had already been sold. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was a resolution, and it closed with the specific satisfaction of a problem solved through practical action rather than left to fester. On the ride home from Caldwell after the recovery, Marshall reached across the wagon seat and took her hand without saying anything, just holding it for the remaining 6 miles of road, and she leaned slightly against his shoulder, and they watched the winter landscape move past in its pale brown and white silence. Spring came again, and with it, the second cattle sale at Caldwell. Winifred stood at the same rail where she had stood the year before. The difference was considerable. She stood beside Marshall this time, their hands occasionally brushing on the rail, and she was aware that everyone in the yard knew who she was now, the woman who had stood here a year ago with her 32 head while the buyers made their jokes, and who now stood here as Marshall Malone's wife and the co-operator of 2 of the better-managed properties in Sumner County. Dexter Prout was there again. He came to stand near them at the rail, and he nodded to Marshall and then looked at Winifred with an expression that had evolved considerably from the one he had worn 12 months ago, something that acknowledged, without being comfortable about it, that he had misjudged something. "Mrs. Malone," he said. "Mr. Prout," she said pleasantly. He moved along the rail. Marshall was looking at his boots. When she glanced at him, she found he was suppressing something that was at constant war with the corner of his mouth. "Don't," she said. "I'm not doing anything," he said, entirely without credibility. Her lot came through the ring, a larger and better prepared selection than the previous years, and the bidding was different this time. It was brisk. It was competitive. There was nothing novelty about it. No laughter, no performative confusion. There were 3 buyers who wanted what she was selling, and they bid against each other with the focused urgency of men who understand value, and the gavel came down at a price that made Ezra, standing behind them at the rail, make a sound that was not quite a word but was unmistakably satisfied. She looked at Marshall. He was looking at her with those eyes. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just watching. You look very pleased." "I am very pleased," he said. "I was pleased last year too when I was bidding. I'm just pleased for different reasons this time." "Last year you were pleased because you got good cattle at a fair price," she said. "Last year I was pleased because I had an excuse to talk to you afterward," he said. She took his arm and they walked together along the rail, and the spring sale of 1883 went on around them, loud and dusty and busy and thoroughly ordinary, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. That summer she found she was expecting their first child. She told Marshall on a morning when they were both up before sunrise, standing on the porch of the Boone house watching the dawn come over the eastern pasture. She simply told him directly, in the plain way she told him everything. He stood very still for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and pulled her against him, and she felt the breath go out of him in a long, slow release that said everything about what he was feeling without requiring any of the words that he was clearly at a loss for. "Marshall," she said after a moment. "I'm all right," he said, though his voice was doing something interesting. "I'm very all right. I just need a moment." She stood within the circle of his arm and watched the sky turn from gray to gold over her father's land, and felt the deep settled certainty of someone who has found the life they were supposed to be living. The pregnancy was not easy. She was ill through the summer months, more than she would have wished, and it frustrated her in the practical way that anything frustrates her when it interrupts her ability to work. Marshall was, during this period, a study in the particular talent of someone who wants desperately to help and understands that the most helpful thing is often simply to be present without hovering. He took on more of the daily ranch work without comment. He rode both properties with an expanded crew, having hired 2 additional hands, a young man named Amos who had come up from the territory looking for steady work, and an experienced older hand named Ferris who had 20 years of ranching behind him. He reorganized the morning routine so that the heaviest work was done before Winifred was even out of bed, and he brought her coffee every morning himself, which was a small gesture and also the most consistent kindness she had ever received. She told him once, on an afternoon when the illness had passed and she was sitting on the porch feeling more like herself, that she was grateful for how he handled things. "You don't have to be grateful," he said. "You're growing a person. I'm just moving fence posts." She looked at him. "You know that when I say I'm grateful, I'm not saying I couldn't manage without you." "I know," he said. I know exactly what you're saying, and I'm saying you don't have to feel obligated to manage without me when you don't have to." He paused. "I'm here, that's all." That was all. It was enough. It was, she thought, considerably more than enough. The child was born in February of 1884, exactly 2 years after her father had died in the East Pasture. It was a boy. Marshall delivered him with the help of a midwife named Mrs. Hartley from Caldwell, a broad, calm woman who had delivered more children than she could count, and whose presence in the room made Winifred feel that everything was being handled by someone who knew what they were doing. He was a large, healthy boy with his father's dark eyes and a quantity of black hair that Mrs. Hartley pronounced exceptional, and his mother pronounced ridiculous. They named him Clement, after Winifred's father. When they put the baby in Marshall's arms for the first time, something happened to his face that she had not seen before and would never entirely forget. Not the smile, not the attentive look, but something below both of those, something foundational, something that looked like a man discovering a new country of himself that he hadn't known was there. "Hello," he said, very quietly to Clement. Clement studied him with the unfocused gravity of someone who has just arrived and is still forming opinions. Ezra came to see the baby that afternoon. He sat in the chair by the bed and held him with the expertise of someone who had held children before, somewhere in a life that predated his years at the Boone Ranch, and looked at his face for a long time. "Clement," he said, trying the name. "Clement Marshall Malone," Winifred said. Ezra nodded once, looked at the baby, and then said to the ceiling in a voice that was not quite directed at anyone present, "There he is, sir." And then he didn't say anything else for a while, and nobody required him to. Life on the combined Malone-Boone operations settled into its rhythms over the following years. Those rhythms that belong to land worked consistently by people who understand and love it. There were good years and difficult ones, as there always are. In 1885, a late frost took a portion of their spring calves, and they had to adjust the summer sale. In 1886, a particularly good season produced their best profit to date, enough to complete the barn expansion at the Double M that they had been planning for 2 years. They made significant improvements to the Boone house, not changing its essential character, but making it more comfortable, adding a proper water pump, improving the kitchen according to the plans Winifred had drawn up years earlier. They built a second bedroom onto the back for when Thomas and Clara came to visit, which they did every summer, and the kitchen became a place where Winifred and Clara spent long evenings comparing notes on everything from crop rotation to apple preserves to the particular challenges of being women in a world that was still in the process of deciding what it thought about women who ran things. Young Clem grew with remarkable speed, as children do, into a person rather than simply a baby. He was serious and observant in the way of his father, and had inherited his mother's stubborn competence, a combination that was occasionally challenging to manage and consistently delightful to witness. By the time he was 3, he was following Marshall around the yard with the dedicated purposefulness of someone who has identified a mentor and intends to learn everything. By 1887, Winifred was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, or she was more accustomed to it, or the particular misery of the first time had recalibrated her sense of what difficult meant. She worked through the summer with more capacity, and was at the cattle sale in Caldwell in September with a full lot that she managed herself from the registration to the gavel, standing at the same rail, in the same yard, with a composure that now owed nothing to effort and everything to the simple fact of being who she was. She saw Dexter Prout across the ring. He was older now, heavier, his gold watch chain hanging in the same place. He watched her lot move through the bidding, a competitive bidding that resolved at a strong price, and when it was done, he caught her eye across the ring and did something she had not expected from him. He nodded, a single, genuine nod of acknowledgement. She returned it because it cost her nothing, and because the man had at least arrived, even if late at a correct understanding of things. Marshall was beside her at the rail. He had been there for every sale since that first one, not to manage it, but because he was her husband and the sales were part of their shared life, and he liked being present for them. "Strong price," he said. "Stronger than last quarter," she said. "We should think about expanding the eastern herd before spring," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "I want to look at the water source first. We had a low August, and I want to understand what a prolonged dry spell would mean before we commit to more head." He nodded. "Good thinking." "I have a project for you," she said. "What project?" "The water assessment. I need someone to ride the entire eastern boundary and map the water sources in detail, all of them, including the secondary ones." He looked at her sideways. "You're assigning me work." "I'm assigning my husband a project that requires a skilled and experienced eye," she said. "Yes." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She laughed and took his arm, and they walked out of the stockyard into the bright September morning. And the town of Caldwell moved around them in its ordinary busyness. The horses and wagons and the dust and the sound of commerce. And somewhere at the edge of all of it, the memory of a young woman standing alone at a rail while men made her a joke, and a man on the other side of the ring who had looked at what was real rather than what was expected, and said so with his bid. Their second child was born in December of 1887, a boy they named Ezra James, after the old man who deserved the honor and who received news of it sitting on the porch of the Boone house where he had been sitting in various configurations for nearly 2 decades. "You don't have to do that," he said when Marshall told him. "We want to," Marshall said. Ezra was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'd be honored." And that was all. But it was the most he had said about his feelings on most subjects in all the years Winifred had known him, and it was enough. Young Ezra was different from his brother from the first week of his life, louder and more insistent, and equipped with an opinion about everything that he communicated in increasingly sophisticated ways as he grew. Where Clem observed and considered, Ezra decided immediately and committed fully. Where Clem followed Marshall at a respectful distance, Ezra attached himself to his mother's work with a determination that made her laugh every day. By the spring of 1888, the ranch was flourishing in the way that things flourish when they are tended by people who understand what they are doing and believe in what they are building. The combined Malone and Boone lands made a substantial holding, well-managed and productive, known in Sumner County for the quality of the stock and the reliability of the management. Winifred had also begun something that had not been entirely planned. The previous autumn, a young woman named Della Price had come to the ranch looking for work. She was 17, the daughter of a homesteader whose claim had failed, and she was plainly capable and plainly determined, and plainly in a situation that required someone to give her a chance at something solid. Winifred had hired her on as a domestic hand, and had then discovered within the first month that Della had a genuine interest in and aptitude for ranch management, specifically the breeding and care of cattle. She began teaching her, properly, the way her father had taught her, starting with the fundamentals of animal husbandry, and moving through the management decisions that underlay a successful breeding program. Della absorbed it with the intensity of someone who has been waiting a long time for someone to teach them, something worth learning. Marshall watched this process with the quiet pleasure of someone who recognizes something important happening. "You're building something here that goes beyond the two of us," he said one evening. "Knowledge should go somewhere," Winifred said. "My father gave it to me, I'm giving it to her." "She's going to be something," he said. "She already is," Winifred said. In the summer of 1889, the state of Kansas held its constitutional revision discussions, and along the borders of those discussions were broader arguments about land rights and the future of the territory and the changing nature of the frontier, as the railroads continued their transformation of the landscape. Winifred followed these arguments carefully, reading every newspaper account she could find and talking through the implications with Marshall in the evenings while the children slept above them. The world was changing around the wild frontier that had made this life possible, and she could see it clearly in the way the drovers no longer came up the Kishom Trail in the same numbers, in the way Caldwell itself was evolving from a trail town into something more settled and domestic. The cattle industry was adapting, moving toward more local and regional supply rather than the vast long drives, and the ranchers who would thrive were the ones who understood that and positioned themselves accordingly. "We need to think about diversification," she told Marshall. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She laid it out for him, as she had laid it out in her own mind over several months. A gradual shift in the breeding program toward animals better suited to local markets and shorter transit distances. An increase in the proportion of land given to hay production for the regional feed market, and a possible partnership with the new rail line on freight arrangements that would reduce their transport costs. He listened with the attention he always gave her when she presented a plan, not passive listening but the active, engaged kind, asking questions that tested the logic rather than challenging the premise. "The rail partnership is the most complex piece," he said when she finished. "I know. I want to go to Kansas City in the fall and talk to the freight manager there directly." He looked at her. "You want to take the train to Kansas City?" "Yes, alone. Unless you want to come, but you don't have to." He thought for a moment. "I want to come," he said, "not because you need me there, because I want to see you negotiate with a railroad freight manager." She laughed. "You've seen me negotiate." "Not at that level," he said. "I think it'll be remarkable." The trip to Kansas City was her first time in a city of that size, and it was loud and overwhelming and fascinating in roughly equal measure. The freight manager, a neat, compact man named Mr. Edwin Cole, received her in his office with a courtesy that was professional but measured, the courtesy of someone withholding judgment. He had not dealt with a woman rancher before, or if he had, not one who had come to negotiate freight terms with a detailed written proposal and full command of the relevant rate structures. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Mr. Cole's professional courtesy had shifted into something that looked considerably more like genuine engagement, and they had arrived at a draft arrangement that would reduce the Malone-Boone freight costs by a meaningful percentage. On the train home, Marshall sat beside her and looked out at the darkening prairie rolling past the window. "You know what I kept thinking in there," he said. "What?" "I kept thinking about the stockyard in Caldwell in 1882, he said, "and those men at the rail, and what they decided before they looked." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about that too sometimes," she said. "It makes me angry," he said simply. "It should," she said, "but look where it went." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I know," he said. "I know exactly where it went." He took her hand on the train seat, and the prairie moved past in the evening darkness, and the lights of small towns appeared and disappeared like slow stars, and she thought about the long shape of things, the way a life accumulates, the way what looks like an ending sometimes turns out to be the first sentence of something considerably longer. Old Ezra's health declined in the winter of 1889. It came on gradually, the way things come when a person has lived a long life and worked hard for most of it, a general slowing, a tiredness that no amount of sleep fully resolved. He still came out every morning to the barn, still checked the water troughs with the habit of decades, but he moved carefully now, and Winifred watched it with the particular sorrow of someone who loves a person and cannot stop what is coming. She moved him into the main house that November, into the back bedroom that she and Marshall had added, and he protested in a general and not very committed way, and then settled in with the dignity of a man who has earned his comfort. She sat with him in the evenings often, while the children were in bed and Marshall was reviewing the ledgers, the two of them in the lamplight of the front room, sometimes talking and sometimes not. He told her things about her father that she hadn't known, small stories from the early years of the ranch, things her father had said and done before she was old enough to remember clearly. "He used to talk to the cattle," Ezra said one evening with a slight smile. "Not giving orders, just talking, telling them about his day." Winifred smiled. I know I used to hear him. He said it kept them calm. Maybe it did. Ezra paused. You do the same thing sometimes, I've noticed. She didn't deny it. I suppose I learned it from him. You learned most of the good things from him, Ezra said, and then you went further. She looked at him. What do you mean? He was a good man, Ezra said. A fine rancher, but he was limited in some ways by what he thought was possible. You never had those limits, or you had them and you didn't care. He settled back in his chair. That's the difference between a good person and an exceptional one. She sat with that for a while in the lamplight in her father's house. Ezra died in March of 1890, quietly, on a morning when the first warmth of spring was in the air and the horses in the yard were restless with it. Winifred found him when she brought his breakfast, sitting in the chair by the window with the pale, early light on his face, looking, she thought, like someone who had found the rest he had been working toward for a very long time. They buried him in the small cemetery on the eastern edge of the Boone land, next to her father, because that was where he belonged and she knew he would have agreed with the placement. Marshall carved the marker himself, working on it in the evenings with a careful attention to the letters, making sure they were clear and even and permanent. The marker read, Ezra James Wells, 1830–1890. He kept the faith and the fences. Winifred stood at the grave on the morning they said it and read it, and thought it was exactly right. Della Price had grown. Over the 2 years she had been working at the Boone Ranch, into the skilled and capable person that Winifred and Marshall had both seen coming. She was 19 now, confident in her knowledge, responsible in her management, and beginning to develop her own opinions about breeding programs that were original and thoughtful rather than simply derivative of what she had been taught. She had also begun to attract the attention of a young man from Caldwell, a carpenter's apprentice named Peter Holt, who came out to the ranch regularly with increasingly transparent excuses, and Winifred watched this with the quiet pleasure of someone who had once been on the other side of it. "Does he make you happy?" she asked Della one afternoon. Della colored slightly. "He makes me laugh," she said. "He's very earnest." "Earnest is good," Winifred said. "Earnest means he means it." "Is that how Mr. Malone was?" Della asked, and then immediately looked as though she was not sure she should have. Winifred considered it. "He was earnest," she said, "and direct. He told me he was in love with me while we were sitting on the roof of this barn." Della stared. "The roof?" "We were patching it," Winifred said, and smiled at the memory, at the hammer falling off the edge, at his real unmanaged smile breaking open in the summer heat. The spring of 1891 brought their third child, a daughter this time, born in April when the prairie around the Boone Ranch was in its finest bloom. They named her Clara, after Marshall's sister-in-law, who cried when she heard it, and then wrote a letter of such warmth and length that it arrived in 2 envelopes. Clara Malone came into the world with a certainty about herself that was evident from the beginning, and would only grow more pronounced over time. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's direct eyes, and an immediate and uncompromising set of opinions about the world that delighted both her parents and made her brothers view her with a mixture of admiration and wariness. Clem was 7 by then, steady and thoughtful, already useful on the ranch in the small practical ways that a child who has been paying attention becomes useful. Young Ezra was 3, loud and decisive and constantly in motion, full of a kinetic energy that Marshall managed with a patience that Winifred found beautiful to witness. She found him one Saturday morning in the barn, sitting in the hay with young Ezra in his lap, reading to him from a book about horses. Not a children's book, but a genuine book about horse management that Winifred's father had owned, and young Ezra was listening with the specific focused quality he brought to things that interested him. She stood in the barn door for a moment, unnoticed, watching the 2 of them in the slant of morning light through the boards, her husband and her son, the book open across Marshall's knee, his voice going steadily through the words. She thought about the morning at the stockyard, the cold and the dust and the laughter and the silence that preceded a fair bid. She thought about the long accumulation of everything that had followed, The kitchen table evenings and the barn roof, and the dance at Sumner, and the porch at night, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of the life they had built together on this land, and the land to the north, and everywhere in between. She thought about what her father would say. She thought he would say it was good. She thought he would say it was very good indeed. Marshall looked up and saw her in the doorway. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and came in out of the light. The years that followed were the years of consolidation, of a life built solidly enough that it could contain the unexpected without being destabilized by it. The Malone-Boone operation became one of the most consistently productive in the county, not the largest but the best managed, known for the quality of its stock and the quality of its people. Winifred served for a time on the county agricultural board, the first woman to do so, and she managed the distinction with the same composure she brought to everything, neither shrinking from the notice nor performing it, simply doing the work that needed doing and letting the results speak. Della Price married Peter Holt in the summer of 1892, in a small ceremony at the Caldwell church that Winifred attended with Marshall and all 3 children, and felt a particular satisfaction about that she recognized as the satisfaction of someone who had been part of something good coming to fruition. Della continued to work at the ranch until the following spring, when she and Peter established their own homestead east of Caldwell on a modest but promising piece of land, and Winifred sent them off with a breeding pair of her own animals and a detailed account of everything she knew about managing them. "You gave her the foundation animals," Marshall said, when the wagon had gone. "She earned them," Winifred said. "She learned everything I could teach her and then started teaching herself things I didn't know." "You gave her the start, Freddie." She turned to look at him. He used the shortened name occasionally now, not as a diminution but as an intimacy, the way long familiarity distills names to their essence. "My father gave me the start," she said. "I'm just passing it along." In the October of 1893, Winifred and Marshall stood at the rail of the Caldwell stockyard for what was, by her count, the 12th consecutive year. The sale had changed. The town had changed. The frontier was changing. The wild and open thing it had been giving way steadily to something more organized and bounded. The barbed wire and the railroad, and the legislation of land that had once seemed boundless. There were fewer long drives now, fewer of the dramatic spectacles of thousands of longhorns moving north from Texas to fill the pens at Trail's End. But the fundamental thing, the assessment of value, the honest bidding on real animals by people who understood what they were looking at, that remained. It would always remain, she thought, as long as there were animals and land, and the people willing to give their lives to the combination. A young woman was at the rail not far from them, perhaps 20 years old, holding a lot ticket and watching the ring with the expression Winifred remembered from her own face in 1882. Alert and careful and prepared for dismissal. She watched the lot come through. She watched the bidding start low and stay there while the men around the young woman made the calculations that had nothing to do with the animals and everything to do with who was presenting them. She felt Marshall shift beside her. "That's a good lot," he said, quietly, looking at the animals in the ring. "It is," she said. "Someone should say so," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those eyes, unchanged by a decade, still the same direct attentiveness that had been the first thing she had truly recognized about him. "Go on, then," she said. He stepped forward to the rail and raised his voice over the murmuring crowd and named a figure that was fair and full and unambiguous, and she watched the young woman's face change, the way a face changes when something true and unexpected is said into an atmosphere of dismissal. The bidding found its level after that, other buyers recognizing the signal and the quality simultaneously, and the gavel came down at a price that was honest. The young woman came around the ring afterward. She stopped in front of Marshall and said, "Thank you for a fair bid." He touched the brim of his hat. "It was a fair price for fair cattle," he said. "That's not charity." Winifred heard her own words in his mouth and loved him so enormously in that moment that it was a physical thing, something that pressed against the inside of her chest and asked for more room than was available. The young woman looked between them. "Do you know these cattle?" she asked Winifred with the directness of someone who has decided she might as well ask the obvious question. "I know good cattle," Winifred said, "and yours are good." She paused. "My name is Winifred Malone. I run the Boone Malone operation out of Sumner County." The young woman straightened slightly. "I've heard of it," she said. "My father talked about the Boone breeding program." "Your father knew good stock," Winifred said. She studied the young woman's face. "Would you like to have lunch? I want to know about your operation." The young woman's name was Ruth Carey, and she was 21 years old, and her father had died the previous winter, and she was at the sale alone with 30 head because she had no other option. She sat across from Winifred and Marshall at Mrs. Farwell's restaurant, the same restaurant where Winifred had eaten her first solo lunch after the sale 11 years ago. And she told her story in the plain, practical way of someone who has learned that sentiment has its place, and the place is not a business conversation. Winifred listened and asked questions and watched Marshall do the same, the two of them attending to Ruth Carey with the full weight of their combined experience and expertise, because it cost them nothing and meant everything. By the end of lunch, there was an understanding in place. Ruth Carey would correspond with Winifred about her breeding program over the winter. Winifred would review her management plan and offer observations. In the spring, if she wanted to, she was welcome to bring her stock to the Boone Malone operation for a week and learn what there was to learn from seeing a large established operation up close. "Why are you doing this?" Ruth asked at the end of it. Winifred thought about it for a moment. "Because someone did something fair for me once," she said, "at a time when the room had decided it wasn't going to, and it changed the shape of things." She looked at Marshall when she said it. He was looking at his coffee cup with the expression that meant he was not going to say anything because he was fairly certain that anything he said would be inadequate to what he was feeling. "I believe in paying things forward," Winifred said, "especially the fair ones." Ruth Carey rode out of Caldwell that afternoon on a good horse with the receipt for her cattle in her pocket, and a connection to something larger than herself newly established. And Winifred watched her go from the door of the restaurant, with the feeling of a door that had been pressed shut against its frame opening, just a fraction more. That evening, on the road home to the Boone Ranch, with the autumn sky going deep amber ahead of them and the familiar Kansas landscape settling into its evening stillness, Marshall drove with one hand on the reins and his arm around her, and she sat against him with her head against his shoulder and watched the road unwinding ahead. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My father," she said, "and Ezra and that first morning at the stockyard." "What about it?" "I'm thinking about what it cost," she said, "and what it gave back, and how you can never know at the time which thing a moment is going to be." He was quiet for a while, the horses moving steadily in the early dark. "That first morning," he said, "I went to the sale not planning to buy anything. I'd already made my purchases for the quarter. I went because Grady had mentioned there was an unusual lot and I was curious." She looked up at him. He was watching the road ahead. "I saw you at the rail before I saw the cattle," he said. "And then I went to look at the cattle and they were exactly as good as you clearly believed they were." He paused. "And then those men started laughing and something in me decided very simply that it wasn't going to go that way." "You bought 32 head of cattle to make a point," she said. "I bought 32 head of cattle because they were worth $42 a head," he said. The point was incidental. He glanced down at her. "The cattle were genuinely excellent, Freddie. I would have bought them regardless. I didn't need the injustice to motivate me. The quality was enough." "But the injustice helped," she said. "The injustice helped," he admitted. "Yes." She settled back against his shoulder. The ranch lights were visible ahead through the early dark, the warm yellow of the kitchen lamp in the window, and from this distance it looked exactly like what it was, a home, substantial and lit and occupied by the particular lives that had built up around it over years and years of ordinary, extraordinary days. "Marshall," she said, "I'm glad you came to the sale that morning." "So am I," he said. "I'm glad every morning I've been alive since then." She took his free hand in both of hers and held it, and the horses walked the last mile home through the autumn dark, and the stars came out above the Kansas plain in their vast familiar arrangement, and the lamp burned steadily in the window of her father's house. They came through the gate, and the horses moved into the yard, and she could hear, from inside the house, the sound of her children, Clem's low voice and young Ezra's enthusiastic interruptions, and Clara's decisive contribution to whatever argument was in progress, and the whole warm living noise of it came through the walls and the windows, and met them in the yard like something that had been waiting for them, which it had. Marshall helped her down from the wagon and held her hand for a moment in the dark yard before they went in, and she looked at his face in the light coming through the window, this face she knew as well as she knew the land, as well as she knew her own hands. "Ready?" he said. "Always," she said. They went inside. The kitchen was warm with the fire and the smell of the stew that had been cooking since afternoon, and Clem was sitting at the table with a book open, and young Ezra launched himself off his chair toward his father with the full committed velocity of a small person who has no doubt whatsoever about the reception he will receive. And Clara was explaining something at length, and with considerable conviction to no one in particular. Marshall caught young Ezra and held him on his hip, and listened to Clara's explanation with the serious attention she required. Winifred took off her coat and moved to the stove and checked the stew and called everyone to table, and dinner happened the way dinners happen in houses where people love each other, with the noise and the passing of things and the small daily news and the laughter that comes without planning. After the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she and Marshall sat at the kitchen table the way they had sat at kitchen tables together for 11 years, with the lamp between them and the ledgers and the correspondence and the familiar shorthand of two people who have shared so much that they can say important things in very few words. She looked at the ledger columns and thought about the spring. She thought about Ruth Carey and what she might make of her operation with the right knowledge. She thought about Clara's particular determined quality and what it would become over years. She thought about the Boone Malone land, both properties, the South and the North, the water sources and the fences and the breeding records going back 30 years in her father's hand, and then continuing in hers and eventually, she supposed, in the hands of the children upstairs. She thought about a woman standing at a rail in a dusty yard while men decided she was a curiosity, and a bid that cut through all of it like a clear note in a muddy room. "What are you thinking about?" Marshall asked without looking up from his papers. "Everything," she said. He looked up then and smiled at her, the real one, the unmanaged one that had been changing her composure since the day she first saw it on a barn roof in the July heat. "Everything's good," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Outside, the Kansas night held the ranch in its enormous silence, the stars thick above the plain, the horses quiet in the barn, the autumn air carrying the smell of grass and distance, and the particular quality of space that belongs to places where the sky is unobstructed and the horizon is honest, and a person can see, if they look, very nearly to the edge of the world. Inside, the lamp burned steadily on the kitchen table where Winifred Boone and Marshall Malone sat together with their life spread out around them. All the years of it, all the ordinary, extraordinary dailiness of it, all the love accumulated in small, consistent acts of recognition and fairness, and showing up and staying, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was theirs.